Lawrence, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oklahoma State University. I'm also the director of the relatively new religious studies program there. We started it about 4 years ago. I have a PhD from 1997, Boston University. I have a degree in theology from Yale. I did my undergraduate, York University, Toronto. I actually specialize in the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, but I also publish periodically on Pascal, which I guess is the topic for today.
Yeah, so the topic was Pascal's wager. So could you tell me what is Pascal's wager and what is your position on it?
So most arguments for God's existence, ontological argument, cosmological argument, design argument, are meant to prove that God exists. Pascal's wager is different. There are a couple other arguments of that ilk as well, whose goal is not to prove God's existence, but rather to provide a justification for the belief in God. And so the essence of the wager is we are not so epistemically situated as to be able to prove God's existence according to the standard arguments. We're not so epistemically situated as to be able to even assess the probability of God's existence. For the sake of the argument, though, Pascal asks people to grant that that probability is not zero. So there is some positive probability that God exists, but we're not in a position to know what that probability is. So the argument basically goes as follows. Let's say you have one, I call it a theological hypothesis. Let's say you have this theological hypothesis that there is a God, and that if you do the right thing, that you will be rewarded in the afterlife with some, infinite, blissful state, the beatific vision, the beatific state it's sometimes called. So let's say there's this theological hypothesis, there is a God. If you satisfy God's requirements, then you receive this eternal, infinitely valuable heavenly reward. Now, the odds of that might be infinitesimally small, right? The probability of truth of that claim might be the tiniest fraction of a possibility, 0.0000001%. However, the value of that state of affairs, if it's true, is infinite. And so Pascal basically says, here are your options. You could either believe this theological hypothesis and thus make yourself suitable for that infinite reward, or reject that theological hypothesis. And then let's say, the result is either you go to hell or you just simply cease to exist. So the way he sets this up is, he sets this up in terms of a decision theoretic table. I forgot to ask in advance, am I able to screen share?
Yes, there should be a screen share button at the bottom somewhere, like a picture of a computer screen with an arrow on it.
Yeah. So let me select tab to preview application window. Okay. So here it is. This is kind of helpful. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So this is very much the standard way in which the decision theoretic table for the wager is set up. You have two hypotheses. God exists, God doesn't exist. More fully, God exists, there's this heavenly award, versus God doesn't exist, and basically we just die when we die. So that's the top, the columns. And then the rows are, here are your two options. You can either choose that God exists, or you don't choose that God exists. You choose that God doesn't exist. And so when you think about the mathematics of the situation here, even if it is infinitesimally small probability that God exists, because the value of that state of affairs in the afterlife is of infinite value, the expected utility, the probability times the value of the outcome, is infinite. By contrast, if you choose that God doesn't exist, and God doesn't exist, what do you end up with, right? Basically, you're just going to end up with an ordinary life. It'll be a little different if you're a theist or an atheist, but some finite value. If you choose that God doesn't exist and God does exist, let's just assume you cease to exist when you die. You don't go to heaven, you don't go to hell, you just simply pop out of existence. So the only value basically is the finite value of your current life. And then likewise, let's say you choose that God does not exist and God does not exist. Again, likewise, you lead your ordinary life. There's some finite value to it, and that's it. So when you look at this decision theoretic table, the optimal utility is basically to choose God's existence, because it's the only scenario whereby you have the chance of that infinite value. If you choose that God doesn't exist, you end up with some finite situation. If you choose that God does exist, either you end up with a finite situation if you're wrong, or you end up with the infinite thing. And so the net benefit to you is that it's in your rational self-interest. If you were to sort of think about summing each of the rows, it's in your rational self-interest to choose that God exists. You might be wrong, but you're not going to lose very much. You're going to lose maybe just a few differences in finiteness with respect to your life. But if you're right, you get that infinite value. So Pascal basically is saying it's in your rational self-interest to believe that God exists. And for context here, what Pascal is doing is, this is not Pascal saying, hey, everyone, this is how you should approach religion. That's not what he's doing here. He's not saying this is the final word. By no means. This is, in a certain sense, for him, he's pitching it as a starting point. Specifically, what Pascal is doing is he's saying to the quote unquote libertines of his day, right? Basically, the people that are just partying it on, right? He's saying to those guys who are living this life of self-interest, think this through. If your principle of choice about how you're going to live is your own self-interest, then following the mathematics here, it would be in your rational self-interest to adopt theism. And so it's a kind of apologetic, trying to convince the non-believer to believe. However, it's not, again, meant as the final word. What Pascal has in mind here is to take the atheist, to take the non-believer, and say, if I could persuade you of the wager here that it's in your rational self-interest, so to open your mind to this possibility, then what you need to do is take that as your starting point to cultivate a real faith. But this is how the game starts, so to speak.
Sure. So my problem that I've always had this argument is that it seems like there's going to be a plus infinite in every one of those boxes. And I don't see why there's only a plus infinite in the one box. It seems like it's presupposing a particular kind of a God, the Christian God. So, for example, you could have a God who exists who only lets atheists into heaven, or only lets people who doubt until sufficient evidence is provided or something into heaven, in which case God could exist and not believing would have the positive infinity, and believing would then, of course, have the zero, or I forget what the symbol you used was.
Yeah. Do you have to approve it? I put up another.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Right. So, in a sense, what you're talking about is what's called the many gods objection, right? And so, one of the earliest and one of the best known rebuttals to Pascal's wager is that why should you assume just one theological hypothesis? Maybe the only people who go to heaven are people that are rational enough to not believe in God, right? Or maybe the only people who go to heaven are people who are nice to animals. Or maybe the only people who go to heaven are bastards. Or maybe the only people who go to heaven are people that drink a lot, right?
Or pick their nose on a Tuesday, or eat jelly
Right,
donuts.
right.
Like
Because
literally any
all
action.
you need to get the argument going is something above a zero probability for the hypothesis, right? So there's untold numbers of alternative theological hypotheses that have a probability, we might presume, to have a probability above zero. And so in that case, you're in this aporetic state. You're in a state where you don't know what direction to go, because rather than saying that you have a clear dominance, that it's obvious that one choice is better than the other, instead, if you have a multiplicity of theological hypotheses with infinite utility. So, it's a jealous God. If you choose A, right, then if B is true, then you'll be punished. So if they're mutually exclusive, then you're in the aporetic state. You don't know which hypothesis to follow. And that's perhaps the most famous, certainly one of the most famous objections to Pascal's wager.
And what is your take on do you think that is a successful defeater for Pascal's argument? Do you think it's missing something?
So, like I said, I've dabbled in the wager. I'm not. This is per se my specialty. Like I said, my specialty is Immanuel Kant, but Kant has his own argument for religious belief that, like Pascal, is meant to provide us with a rational basis for belief that's not a matter of proving God's existence. So they're both practical arguments. And so that kind of is thinking about Kant on that led me also to think about Pascal on that. And so I think the many gods objection is an absolutely serious problem. Now, here are a few ways around it, at least partial ways. One paper that I wrote, a little over 10 years ago now, and if I can mention it, I have a collection on Pascal's wager that I co-edited with Cambridge University Press, and I have a paper on this topic in there too. But basically, I provide a partial response to the many gods objection there. And the response is there are at least some theological hypotheses that could be eliminated from the decision table on purely formal grounds. So a lot of the time when people try to defend the wager against alternative theological hypotheses, they do things like say, well, only live hypotheses, ones that people are going to take seriously, like parts of like traditional religions. You're going to give up things like, the Chardonnay god and the sidewalk crack god and crazy things like that. But you have to have these live hypotheses. You have to have these hypotheses that reflect a real tradition. I don't like that because I think that it gives up on the kind of decision under ignorance. It kind of creates some epistemic preference that I think goes against the spirit of the wager. But I think that there's a few other ways to respond to the many gods objection, and they don't fully defeat them all, but it helps kind of give us a path to thinking about some solutions. And so one is maybe there are, so to speak, formal decision theoretic principles that would give us the basis for excluding certain theological hypotheses. So you're familiar with like Descartes', evil deceiver, right?
Yep.
Okay. So imagine that's the deity we're talking about, right? So imagine that there is some deity out there that can so affect the way my mind works, that deity can manipulate my thoughts in any way, including my ability to do arithmetic. All right. So imagine if that's the theological hypothesis that I'm considering. Now, if I say, should I take that as a serious hypothesis, something that maybe I will assent to, the problem is that deity is one that could so screw around with my mind that I will no longer think that I'm in that situation where I can even assess the rationality, right? The prudentiality, the expected utility, the mathematics of this decision. So I can't introduce that without undermining what I need to assume with respect to my own cognitive abilities to be able to even get started on analyzing a decision table. So it's just one hypothesis, but one could possibly enumerate others based upon, again, these sort of formal principles.
Oh, sure, I would agree. So I would think that if your hypothesis entails that there is a God who is actively deceiving you in everything you're trying to do, then obviously you would be unable to follow through the logic of the decision table because it's being undermined actively by the God.
Right.
But for me, I think the question is does Pascal's wager provide a probabilistic increase to the fact that you'll gain this positive effect with a God versus without a God? Now, I want to go a step further because I think this table is good, but I think there's another step, which is say there's a naturalistic hypothesis. You can have a heaven without a God.
Uh-huh.
It is possible to have an infinite reward with no God. And so on the other side of the table, which is God does not exist, and you believe you could get into heaven. There could be some law of the universe in such a case that having some belief could get you into heaven, even if there's no God. And the inverse is also true. There could be a universe where if you actively do not believe or you're an atheist, that's what gets you into heaven without a God.
Right.
And so it seems like the infinite utility applies to every single instance on the table of these hypotheses that don't actively diminish your ability to do rationality. So even if we omit the ones that have like logical contradictions or actively destroy your ability to do rationality, of the logically possible ones remaining, it seems the possibility of both the God and non-God hypotheses have an equal percent chance of getting you the infinite utility.
Many do. So let me give you another, because I'm sympathetic with the point that you're raising, but I'm going to push it a little farther. The extent to which you can eliminate certain hypotheses, let's think about sort of issues of justice. So imagine, instead of the Cartesian demon example, imagine if you had like Loki as your god, like a trickster god, right? And so let's say that trickster god, just because he would enjoy the gotcha, right? Instead of giving you your heavenly reward, capriciously, just because he was in the mood that day, to send you to hell instead, right? Now, is that a hypothesis that you could introduce into the table? Well, presumably not, because it doesn't provide a stable relationship between the presumed outcome, right, in that theological hypothesis, and your intent in your choosing, right?
I don't
So,
quite follow. So, because I think the argument entails anything that is a non-zero probability, correct? And so, even if Loki has some percent chance to be
right,
malicious on day X
right,
and some percent chance to be benevolent on day Y,
right.
there is still some percent chance that believing in Loki could get you into heaven if that particular belief is the one that makes him want to get you into heaven in any particular day.
Right. So, but here I am now, as this wagerer in a state of epistemic ignorance. I'm not in a position to say theological hypothesis one versus theological hypothesis two has any greater probability, right? I'd say, according to the theological hypothesis one, if I do what I'm supposed to do, I get to heaven. According to theological hypothesis two, I may or may not, right? So I might do everything required of me, but I still don't go to heaven. Now, subjectively, I would then say it's in my interest to pursue one versus two, assuming they're mutually exclusive.
Wait, why? I don't quite follow, because it seems like having some kind of strong conditional that if you do X, you'll get into heaven if this God exists or whatever, versus if this God exists, it's by chance. I don't see why that would make. I mean, it might be slightly, possibly less probable given the chance of Loki, but it could actually be more probable too, because now it's not dependent on the belief; it's dependent upon the disposition of the being, and it could be the case that the amount of dispositions of the being is fewer than the amount of potential beliefs that you could have. And so, of this God, there's infinitely many beliefs you could have that could potentially get you to heaven. But Loki only has two dispositions: let
Mm,
you into heaven, don't let you into heaven. And so,
yeah.
it may actually be the case that you're more likely to get into heaven if Loki's the case than if the other God's the case, and you believe in him.
So if you think about it in terms of the probabilities, what you could say is this: that hypothesis one, right, is the stable God. With hypothesis one, then basically all that I need to do is I need to say, if I believe in P and P is true, right, then I get the reward. With hypothesis two, right, it's if I believe in P and P is, how do I put it? Um, P
Well,
may or
let me
may
try.
not.
I think it's that you believe in P,
Yeah,
and the God is in a good disposition to reward P, and so
yeah,
it seems like there'd be an initial lower probability on the second hypothesis, because
right.
not only do you need to believe in P, but also the God has to be in a good mood.
Yeah.
But I think the probability changes in that the God can also be in a good mood, and you don't believe in P, and he lets you into heaven. And so it seems like the probabilities would be the same here, in that the condition is the God's disposition isn't exclusively he has to be in a good disposition and you have to believe, because it could be the case that like obviously in that case it would be a lower probability where you have to believe and the God has to be in a good disposition, and
But part of what
both of
happens,
those must be true.
right? But part of what happens though with the Loki scenario is that capriciousness then kind of washes out the relevance of my choosing, because he might be in the mood to say only those who never wager are the ones who go to heaven, right? And so if I'm trying to find a way to think about how to choose based upon these hypotheses, then it gives me no guidance with respect to what to choose. And so it sort of fails the project, right, of the wager. That's the point I'm trying to make here.
Sure, sure. So I would agree that if there is such a God or such a universe, that the act of choosing can have a positive influence on the outcome, then you have a reason to choose.
Right.
Absolutely. But the question is would that have a higher probability than doing something else other than choosing? Why are we presupposing that choosing would have a positive outcome on the whatever's going on, as opposed to doing something else that Loki may
Right.
like, for
So
example?
let's say I'm completely ignorant with respect to the probabilities. I'm completely ignorant with respect to whether or not my choosing Loki is going to help me or not help me with respect to, right, getting this heavenly reward. Because in this case, in the Loki case, Loki might one day say, yeah, everybody who chooses me goes to heaven, goes to Asgard in this case, and everybody, but in another day he says, people who choose against me, or people who choose, to drink a lot of beer or whatever, right? So it's completely capricious with respect to what he ends up choosing. Now, in that case, then I'd say that it's a throwaway choice, right, to choose Loki. And if what I'm trying to do is I am trying to choose something with this expected utility, right, that optimizes for an afterlife state, then there is no more value to choosing Loki than anyone else. It doesn't give me anything to say I would want to choose that Loki choice. So it sort of goes against the subjective intention, right, that one has. It's not that you're reevaluating probabilities, but it goes against the kind of the formal picture that we have of what we're trying to do in this sort of wager decision theoretic analysis. But these are all kind of minor points, right? That, all that I'm saying is that if you think about what a decision theoretic decision is supposed to look like, then there are some very marginal instances, right, of theological hypotheses that don't quite fit what we want when we're talking about a decision theoretic based decision.
Oh
It
yeah, absolutely.
doesn't.
But
Yeah.
there was one important point I wanted to talk about there, which is that the single instance of Loki
Yeah.
has a multiplicity of possibilities and outcomes, which is a separate decision tree kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But that decision tree of the outcomes of potential Loki dispositions seems to be a one-to-one correlation to the multiple different kinds of gods. And so the fact
Sure.
that Loki's being so capricious makes him less rational to choose under this instance seems to be a good criticism of Pascal's wager in the first instance, because it seems to have the same issue with the multiplicity of gods that Loki does. And so you could simply say that instead of a god who will necessarily let you into heaven if you believe, a Loki who will let you into heaven if he has a good nature or whatever, to
Right.
believing in his nature then becomes the crucial point, that his nature is going to be good rather than the choice being good. But it seems to have a one-to-one correlation with the multiplicity of gods and the multiplicity of personalities of Loki.
I see your point. So basically, the standard decision theoretic problem simply just gets iterated over, right, into, right, all the possibilities that might arise out of Loki. And so, in a sense, then, if there's that problem with Loki, there's a problem with the wagering in general. And so you could say, right, and so, right, that's kind of then gets us to, right, this core problem. Given the many gods objection, is there really ultimately any way around it? And so, like I said, the most common approach has been to introduce claims that I think violate the principle of the wager as a decision under ignorance.
I totally agree with you there. I think that this tactic that people use, that there's the more plausible or more accepted religions or whatever, I forget the exact terminology they use, seems to be begging the question, because the point of the wager is to give a reason to believe without knowing some kind of background evidence. Like obviously, if you have background evidence that God exists, that's a reason that kind of leans in that God's favor as opposed to the other ones.
Yeah.
And so it seems like people are using these kinds of ingrained biases or intuitions towards one particular kind of God as a kind of evidence to already exclude the alternative hypotheses, which, like I agree, goes against the point of the argument, which is to show there's a reason to believe independent of the evidence.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So, is that, so to speak, then the end of the story? Is the many gods objection enough to say it's doomed? Um, and like I said, I see certain points of exclusion, certain hypotheses. I think I listed something like 4 different hypotheses in the paper that I wrote, that for kind of formal reasons, for thinking about what you're trying to do in a wager and reliability of our epistemic faculties and so on, you could exclude. But 4 out of an infinite number of hypotheses doesn't help you very much. So here's another option that alters the wager, but in some ways has at least a kind of family resemblance to it. In another paper of mine, I actually gave it at a Pascal conference about 6 weeks ago, that thought about the relationship between Kant's so-called moral argument and the wager. So just as a bit of background, Kant basically holds, at least during a so-called critical period, that we are not so epistemically situated as to be able to prove God's existence. So he argues that the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, design argument, all the traditional arguments for God fail. So Kant basically rejects all the arguments for God's existence of that traditional ilk. He also rejects Pascal's wager, because I think his main point in rejecting Pascal's wager is that he felt that it was dishonest, right? That you are lying to yourself in some way in trying to pretend that you believe something you don't when you follow the wager. But Kant has this alternative. And so the alternative that Kant gives us is, it's often referred to as the quote unquote moral argument. And the Kantian moral argument is that we ought to do everything we can to improve ourselves morally. So let's say that we grant that we ought to do everything we can to improve ourselves morally. And then let's say that we have these various hindrances to being moral, our pettiness, our self-interest, our short-sightedness, our ego, our insecurities, right? Our need to think that what we do matters, that it has an effect in the world. And so let's say there's lots of things that hinder our quote unquote moral resolve. Kant proposes this. He proposes that we would be less hindered in our moral resolve if we were theists. So he proposes that if we were to expect that there will be an ultimate justice, and what we need to do is to become quote unquote worthy of happiness, and then God provides for that happiness post-mortem. If we were to adopt that worldview, it would be to our moral betterment, because it would allow us to say things like, even though all the efforts that I've put into making this world a better place have come to naught, all the bad people have swamped the good that I've done, or natural disasters or whatever have ruined it all, that if there is an ultimate justice, then happiness will be provided to those who are worthy of it. So what I then need to do is simply just focus on my moral worthiness. And likewise, if I were to say that, I'm constantly getting distracted or drawn out of matters of self-interest. It's like, I want to buy this for myself, I'm not going to give the money to charity. I have all these issues of personal interest that draw me away from doing the right thing. I'm trying to satisfy my happiness. Now, if I were to believe that happiness gets satisfied post-mortem by God, if I do the right thing, then I could, so to speak, set aside my immediate desires for happiness and play the long game, so to speak, such that God rewards me. Now, this is no proof. This is no argument in the sense that any of this is true. But he's saying that it may very well be to our betterment as human beings to adopt this worldview. And if it is morally incumbent upon us to have that worldview, because assuming it improves us morally, then we ought to, right, be theists. So I'll connect this to the wager in a minute, but I'll pause here because obviously there's points that could be objected to, and I can see in the comments here, right? The long con, you mean delude yourself, and so on. So, right, this is us, even though Kant is criticizing Pascal for being dishonest, right? It sure looks like Kant is doing the same thing, right? That Kant is basically saying you should lie to yourself. Now, here's Kant's way around this. So, an integral part of Kant's mature thought, his so-called critical period, is that, again, to use the phrase I like to use, we are not so epistemically situated as to know whether or not God exists. To prove it, we're not so epistemically situated to know what the nature of ultimate reality is like either. So I guess I could take,
or I can move it away like that,
right,
and
right.
get us both on
So
screen again.
right, so we're not in a position to be able to know what ultimate reality is like. And so one way to think about this is that the epistemic principles that we use to evaluate the world as we experience it don't carry over into epistemic evaluation of like grand metaphysical claims and so on. So we're basically epistemically ignorant with respect to the nature of reality. The epistemic scruples that we use to guide us in the ordinary world just don't apply. And so it's not then that we then have to rebut or find a way to ameliorate, right, this belief relative to these scruples, because we're now standing outside of the domain of epistemic evaluation. And so that means that I don't have this dishonesty in the sense that I'm lying to myself and that I'm adopting something that I ought not adopt, but rather I'm free to choose it. There's nothing that goes against my choosing it. So that's the way Kant presents it. It's a free choice we have because there's nothing that says you're making a mistake. And so with that free choice, I'd say, well, I now have a moral reason to make that free choice. Now, does that mean we really believe it at that point? That's another question. But, we might say cultivate that belief.
So my first question would be is that it seems Kant is assuming that there is a particular morality, and
yes, for sure,
that particular morality is benefited if you do this thing. But it could be the case that an alternative morality may exist, and following this particular solution may go against that morality. And if that one's correct, then this would have the opposite effect. And so I think my many gods parody or stalking horse would be to say the many moralities in this case, where there's many possible ways morality could be, and of the possible ways morality could be, they may or may not agree with Kant's interpretation. So if the utility here is to benefit your moral nature of some kind, and moral nature is objective, the objectivity of the moral nature could be determined by some alternative moral system than what Kant is advocating for, thus leading to the same many gods type problem, but in this case is a many moralities problem.
Right. Now, of course, Kant has arguments against that, right? And so, perhaps is one of his most famous works, probably the one that's, most read in college by undergraduates, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Chapter 1 of the groundwork, effectively, its core argument is basically to show that there is only one possible coherent moral system, which is, of course, his, right?
Yeah.
And so, we need not rehearse that whole argument. Basically, though, that, the argument comes in sort of different forms in different texts, but that's sort of a classic text for it, where he effectively argues that the only possible moral system is the one that he's developing. All the rest can't hold up to what we understand by the concept of morality. And, arguably, it's also predicated upon certain assumptions about human psychology, right? But again, right, without getting into those, if I then connect this back to the wager, then you could say that there is a kind of analogy, right, between the moral argument and the wager, in that both of them are trying to say you have a rational basis for belief, not to say we're proving God's existence, but you have a rational basis for belief. The difference, though, is that in the wager, that rational basis is self-interest. In Kant, the rational basis is moral well-being. So let's go back to let me go back to that other table.
You have to share screen again. Oh, there you
Yep. So here in the standard formulation of the wager, we have the word chooses, right? But I don't specify what the principle of choosing is, right? It's sort of the assumption is when you're talking about the wager, it's self-interest. Now, in a sense, what Kant is doing here is he's giving us kind of a cousin to the wager argument, but the principle of choice, rather than it being self-interest, instead is morality. And it's saying that if you, on moral grounds, choose God's existence and God exists, then you're going to receive this infinite heavenly reward. And so, what does this do now with respect to the many gods objection? So, if you kind of plant into the term choice, moral choice, it actually gives us a way of responding to the many gods objection that we didn't have with Pascal. And the reason why is because in Pascal, the many gods objection arises because there is no intrinsic relationship between the theological hypothesis and self-interest, right? So if it just happens to be that the God requires me to collect hockey cards, right? Then out of self-interest, I'm going to collect hockey cards. If the God requires me to fly in airplanes all the time, then I'm going to fly in airplanes all the time. But there's no necessary relationship between whatever it is that the God requires of me, right? And my choosing. When we talk about a moralized version of the wager, there is then a relationship, right? And that relationship is, if I'm positing here now a God who is going to provide me with a positive afterlife if I become morally worthy of it, then the rationale for the adoption of that hypothesis is, right, to further myself as a moral agent. And so if I then say, should I, out of a moral interest, choose the hockey card God? Of course not, because that's not going to further my moral interest. Should I choose the Chardonnay God? Of course not, because that's not going to further my moral interest. The only hypothesis among these that would further my moral interest is a God that rewards me for the furthering of my moral interest. And so, in a moralized version of the wager, when you take the term choice and you make it choice based on moral grounds, you then establish that intrinsic relationship between the principle of choosing and what the God rewards you for. That then eliminates the many gods problem. Of course, with the caveat that there is just one morality.
But to me, it seems like it's that caveat of that there is one morality seems to be the same kind of a problem initially with Pascal's wager, because in Pascal's wager it assumes there's one kind of a God who's going to give one kind of reward if you believe, and that is, of course, the point of the many gods is to say that that's the you can't assume that, because if assuming that just begs the question of the argument, and so it seems assuming Kant's morality also begs the question of the argument in the exact same way that assuming a particular kind of a God does in the original Pascal's wager.
There's a
And
difference, though.
what's that?
There's a difference. The difference is that Pascal sets up the wager as a decision under ignorance. So we are not epistemically situated as to be able to evaluate, right, the merits of theological hypotheses, right? He simply just pitches basically the standard, roughly Christian idea of a God, right? And so we could say then, he then leaves himself open, right, to the many gods objection because of the epistemic situation that he uses to stage the wager. Now, so there's no argument being given that this is the right theology. In Kant, however, there is an argument given as to this being the right moral theory. We're not adopting the moral theory in a state of ignorance.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, if you're arguing that there is some additional evidence to indicate this one particular hypothesis over the others, then yeah, then that part makes sense. But that does seem to undermine the whole purpose of Pascal's wager, which is to give a reason without that. Because it seems like, as you mentioned earlier, that when people present the argument that there are some standard religions that they go with over others, it undermines the purpose of the argument because it is again begging the question, or select special pleading for these in some case
Yeah.
over the others. And it seems like Kant is doing the same thing, and it invalidates the original point of the argument in the same kind of a way.
Kind of, not quite though, because you'd say that, look, the special pleading argument for traditions, right, is to say that there is greater credibility, right, to a belief set that has had lots of followers, right? And so it's giving a kind of epistemic privilege based upon on that. Now, Pascal's intent is to say we ought not epistemically privilege any hypothesis, right? We ought to simply just, be ignorant, right? With Kant, it's not that we are epistemically privileging, right, the God, but rather I'm saying that, look, if I'm trying to maximize my self-interest in the wager, here's the wager argument. If I'm trying to maximize my moral improvement, right, here's the moralized version of the wager. And so in the case of the wager, we're still talking about, like, if you go back to some of the examples that I gave, we have to say that there are certain formal, right, criteria that restrict the theological hypotheses. A totally capricious God, right, a God that deceives you, and so on. There are certain features that we're going to have to exclude, right? If the whole point is this is supposed to be for the sake of my own self-interest, that my own self-interest has to somehow carry over into it. So that's part of the wager implicitly. Now, if the moral interest, right, is part of the implicit part of the moral argument, then that moral interest carries over into a certain formal restriction as well. So I'm not giving a special pleading argument saying here's some independent reason, right, for adopting a theological hypothesis over another. I'm saying that it flows out of the interest that I have in choosing to begin with.
Well, I would understand, like, we obviously, in the point of the argument is that we want to be moral. And so from that, we have to discover what morality is. And that's the stage where I see is the skip, is where Kant is then making these arguments for his particular morality. And I don't agree with the categorical imperative, not a big fan of that. And so I obviously think his is wrong. And so from the perspective of somebody else who has a different model of morality and disagrees, they could potentially use whatever arguments they have for morality as a substitute for Kant's, and then say that their morality is the one you should be pursuing, and in being in pursuant of that model would lead to an alternative
Right.
belief
So
subset.
So imagine you had, right. Let me go to one of these other tables again. So imagine you had, with the many gods, imagine TH1 is Kantian deontology, and TH2 is consequentialist utilitarianism, right?
Sure.
Right. And so the deity, for one, rewards you based upon whether or not you have acted from duty, right? It's a matter of the nature of your principle of choosing. That's the basis for your reward. In TH2, the deity measures out the net increase in utility in the world by virtue of your actions, and then allots your happiness accordingly. So now here I am saying I want to improve myself morally, but I don't know whether or not to focus upon my inner character or focus upon the efficacy of my actions, right?
I would probably interpret TH2 to be something like, if you maximized the goodness that you could do, then you would get infinite reward or something, rather than saying that the amount of reward you get is proportional to the amount of utility that you maximize, because that would make it a limited number. That make it like a finite number.
Yeah,
To make
I
it
don't.
infinite.
I didn't intend that. I guess if you heard that, that's not what I was meaning.
So in the second case for consequentialist God, say you maximize utility to the best of your extent, or above some positive number, you
Right.
get
Right.
infinite reward.
Yeah. That's my intent. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Right. Okay. So now I'd say, look, I want to be moral, right? So I'm not choosing TH1 or TH2 for the sake of the reward. I'm choosing, right? I'm saying I want to be moral, but I don't know what the right theory of morality is. If I adopt the Kantian theory of morality, I'm going to choose TH1. if I adopt the utilitarian conception of morality, then I'm going to adopt TH2.
And what
Right?
would be the difference between these two? Because it seems like they're still the same as the many gods hypothesis. So why would this be different in the case of Kant's argument?
So still what we have is an intrinsic relationship, right, between my principle of choosing, right, and the principle of rewarding. In the wager, right, my principle of choosing is self-interest. The principle of rewarding might be how many airplanes I fly on. So, but here, my principle of choosing is to be a better person, right, to improve myself morally, to do the right thing, etc. And so that then determines what the theological hypothesis is, because if the psychological claim now is, brought up, then what I'm trying to do in being a theist is I'm trying to say it's going to help me kind of maintain my focus on being moral by taking on that theological worldview. And so I'm not quite sure then that the many morals objection has the same devastating impact.
Well, would it, because if my goal is to maximize my moral nature, if consequentialism is true, objectively moral in some sense, then it seems like in order to maximize my moral nature, I should adopt consequentialism. Versus if deontology is true objectively, like a moral realist consequentialism versus a moral realist deontology, then I should adopt the deontological view. But it still seems like even if we have that starting point of it as our moral nature, or we're trying to maximize our moral nature, that doesn't change or make a difference to which moral model that we adopt, because any moral model we adopt is going to be done so in a way to try to attempt to maximize our moral nature, right?
Yeah. Think about it this way. If I were to say with Pascal, I'd say, look, what I'm trying to do is maximize my self-interest. And I have a plurality of hypotheses that hypothetically would do just as well as the other in maximizing my self-interest. And so that's the aphoretic situation. Now, when it comes to the moralized version of the wager, I have the antecedent question: what's the right theory of morality, right? And so once I adopt what I take to be the right theory of morality, that then defines the term choice, right? Because I'm choosing for the sake of that conception of morality. And then once I've defined choice, right, antecedently, right, to the matrix, once I've defined choice based upon what I think the correct theory of morality is, then that carries over to which theological hypothesis is the one that I would adopt. I'm no longer in that aphoretic situation, because once I've defined and antecedently defined the choice issue, right? So there's an issue of how do I decide that? But once I've antecedently decided this being the right theory of morality, then that understanding of why I'm choosing determines what theological hypothesis I'm going to adopt, because it would be the deity that will be rewarding me for the kind of practices that would be commensurate with the principle of morality that I've decided is the right one. So I don't have the indeterminacy with respect to a multiplicity of columns.
Well, wouldn't that mean the undeterminacy would be in the definition of choice? And so if you're trying to define choice, and the way you define choice is contingent on your model of morality, then it seems if you use a model of morality that has an alternative definition of choice, it would essentially just be the same problem, but instead of it being of morality, it would be of the definition of choice undeterminacy, or the many definitions of choice kind of a thing.
Right, but there what we have is we're not then operating based upon this issue of ignorance. The issue of ignorance, right, that's playing a role in the wager is because we're not trying to probabilistically evaluate which theological hypothesis is true. In the moralized version, likewise, you're not trying to evaluate probabilistically which theological hypothesis is true either. But what you're doing is you're saying, I believe, right, that having a theistic worldview is going to be to my moral betterment. Now, when I cash that out, I then say, well, what theistic worldview in particular? It's the one that's reflective of my conception of morality. And so you're absolutely right that you have the antecedent issue, right, of what's the right conception of morality, and there's a plurality of conceptions of morality. But I'm not bound by the decision under ignorance restriction when it comes to the question, right, of what is the right morality. The restriction for the decision under ignorance instead simply carries with respect to the evaluation of the merits of theological hypotheses.
So could I just do the same thing but remove the God and say, so I'm a moral realist, I'm an atheist, but also a moral realist like most philosophers. And so I say I want to maximize my moral nature, but I'm a moral naturalist, so I think that means accommodating something in the universe, some physical fact of the universe. And so I still want to uh, try to maximize my moral nature, but doing so, I would not adopt a God-based worldview at all. I'd adopt a naturalist worldview.
So let me think about that. So I'd say then that it might be the case that my conception of morality is such that any theology could be deleterious to it. And so if I'm trying to do what I can with respect to my worldview to facilitate myself as a moral agent, then it may be incumbent upon me to reject all theological hypotheses if I see it as the case that it's to my moral betterment to subscribe to a worldview absent any deities. Yep.
Yeah, that sounds right. So, like, yeah, where the moral betterment is a non-God worldview. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that would work as a counter to Kant's version.
I wouldn't say it's exactly it depends on what you mean by counter, because
As an argument for God. So if we were going to take this as an argument to believe in or to pursue God, and this would be pursuing a non-God worldview, the argument could work for equal weight for pursuing Kant's idea of a God-based morality as it would for this naturalist view of a non-God morality.
but think about it sort of at a higher order of abstraction, right? What's going on here is it's saying it's incumbent upon me to adopt a worldview, right, that improves, right, my moral situation, right, my potential for moral improvement or whatever, right? So it's incumbent upon me to adopt a worldview so long as that adoption doesn't violate any epistemic standards, right? So insofar as I have any freedom with respect to it, the adoption of a worldview that's not constrained already by these epistemic standards, then I can make a free choice to adopt a worldview that facilitates, right, my moral situation. Now, if I understand my moral situation to be such that a naturalistic worldview, a non-theism is best for the sake of that morality, then it's the exact same argument that Kant is using, right?
Yeah.
It's just that, we have a few contingent, right, issues that we're choosing between, right? What is that nature of that morality, and maybe certain anthropological claims about, right, about the dynamics of my beliefs in relationship to my motivations and so on.
Oh, yeah, yeah, sure. So I'd say that then it essentially comes down to the extra evidence that's beyond the scope of the argument. Like, is there evidence of this model of morality being correct? And in that case, based on the argument, we should follow whatever that correct model of morality would indicate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so in the case of the wager, right, we already have the antecedent commitment to self-interest. In the case of the moralized version of the wager, we already have the antecedent commitment to morality. And there's a substantive conception of self-interest in one case, and there's a substantive conception of morality in the other case. And so those two conceptions don't fall within the umbrella, right, of decision under ignorance, because the decision under ignorance umbrella pertains instead to the probability of the theological hypotheses. And so there are these antecedent set up claims, right, that the wager and the moralized wager both have with respect to the substantive understanding of what the principle of choice is. And so that's contestable, absolutely, right?
Sure. So I would say that from the atheist perspective, if I can use the same argument for a naturalist hypothesis as he does for a God hypothesis, then it seems like the argument is a bust in its attempt to give us a reason to believe in a God. And since I can just use it for naturalism, and then we would have to default to some other arguments to lean us one way or the other, thereby showing that this argument on its own is pretty insufficient to give us reason to believe
Right.
in God versus not God.
But now it's not an argument on its own. Like, think about it this
Yep.
way. Imagine if you had an argument with 14 steps, right? And you jump into the argument at step 6, and you say step 6 to 14 is a bust because on its own, it doesn't work. Well, I'd say you missed steps 1 through 5, right? And so what you need then is you need to prepare the path for the argument with steps 1 through 5. And that path then is, what's the nature of morality? Now, right, obviously, right, that people read Kant and aren't convinced. So either they don't fully understand Kant or Kant doesn't have a convincing argument. Now, if Kant is right, or Kant does have an argument that's convincing to anybody who paid adequate attention and is not biased against it, right? So if somebody who's like not epistemically hindered, right, approach Kant's argument and they weren't persuaded by it, then the argument, the whole picture is unsatisfactory. On the other hand, if Kant really does have a sufficient argument, so long as somebody understood it and was not epistemically hindered, then the moral wager, right, presumably could still succeed.
Oh yeah, sure. So I'd say that if Kant's moral argument was genuine evidence and did count, then yeah, that would definitely lean in favor of his hypothesis for sure. And so we'd have to, if we could construct a parallel argument where it started with a different moral framework and could equally or better justify that morality, then that would then count as a defeater. And of course, from my worldview, I think we have that. I don't believe in the Kant's morality. I'm a moral
But
naturalist.
you see, it may not count as a defeater, though, right? It may not count as a defeater because if you formalize it all, right, and basically say you ought to adopt a worldview that's optimizes for morality, then it may very well be that that's your worldview already, right? That you think that atheism, right, is the worldview that optimizes for morality.
Yeah,
it's the same argument, except simply, right, we're plugging in different values to the variables.
Right. So it'd just be an argument for a non-God versus an argument for a God. So if we grant the structure of Kant's argument, it's kind of like the cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. Yep, I agree. Love the argument, but the cause is a quantum field. Has nothing to do with a God. And I'm like, all right, we're good. From the atheist perspective, I'm fine with that argument to that point because it doesn't entail a conclusion of a God or indicate the God conclusion at any higher rates than the non-God conclusion. And so if this argument is contingent on accepting the moral argument that Kant has, and I can simply replace his moral argument with my moral argument, then it's essentially comes down to a debate of which moral argument is more compelling and to whom. And then the moral argument becomes the crux of which ideology we should accept. As follows from...
I'd say it a little differently. What I'd say is that we could all agree about, right, that insofar as we have any free choice with respect to our worldview, that is, insofar as all of our epistemic standards, right, don't fully determine all of our beliefs, and there are certain beliefs that we may freely choose that benefit us morally, right, so that we may then develop a worldview under those conditions, right? Then if we're all in agreement with that framework, then the issue of debate is what the moral theory is, and maybe certain anthropological claims about the relationship between belief and motivation. And so, if you're a moral naturalist, then you might think that the naturalistic worldview is more apt. But the thing is that we wouldn't want to say that theism is baked into Kantian ethics, right? And so there's theism independent argument, right, for Kantian ethics. But then once you adopt that Kantian ethical model, at least Kant believes, then that would then give some values to those variables that then carry over into, right? It being in our moral interest to be theists. But now, when it comes to moral naturalism, personally, I'm a constructivist. I'm not a naturalist, right? I find naturalist weird and spooky.
Me too, but I think that's a positive, not a negative. So, so I did want to ask about. You mentioned that Kant gives arguments that his is the only possible model of morality that can fit our understanding of what morality is. What do you mean by that?
All right. So the way in which Kant presents this in the groundwork. So in the preface to the groundwork, he basically addresses the question: what do we mean by morality? Now, arguably, he's already stacking the deck at this point because he understands morality in terms of lawfulness, right? The idea that basically when we say something is good or bad or right or wrong with that moral significance, as opposed to it being a good meal or whatever, when it's morally good or bad, what we mean is that it has a certain kind of authority to it, right? And that authority is best understood in terms of universality and lawfulness, non-contingency, non-arbitrariness, right? And that it should, with appropriate qualifications, be universal, right? So if murder is genuinely wrong, then anything that satisfies what I call murder, it's always wrong and it's necessarily wrong. And so an understanding of morality then is one that has to reflect the ideas of universality and necessity. So now the question is, what substantive moral theory, what substantive theory of right conduct or rightness would satisfy the criteria of universality and necessity? And so if we say, for instance, it's what the Bible says, or we say it's what the government says, right? Or it's the consequences of our actions. In all respects, all these scenarios, all these models are contingent, right? What if it was a different government, right? What if the Bible was written differently, right? What if the effects of your actions were different than they were? So to say this is good or bad, right, based upon those criteria, doesn't satisfy what we mean by morality, whereby our judgments of morality are supposed to be universal and necessary. So Kant then says, every time you try to come up with what he calls material principle of morality, you're going to fail. Because one way or another, every material principle of morality ends up with some features of contingency or non-universality to it. So you have to eliminate every material principle of morality when trying to figure out what the ultimate nature of morality is. Does this leave us with nothing? Kant says no. What it leaves us with is nothing but the mere form of lawfulness itself as the principle of what morality is. And so then Kant says we have a formal principle, right, through which we then could evaluate whether or not our deeds are right or wrong. But you say, like, that's so abstract, right? How could I apply that? And then Kant, starts off by giving us his evil deceiver argument, right? Or I should say, his liar, right? Right? That false promiser, his false promiser example. So out of my self-interest, I'm going to falsely promise to return some money to you that I'm asking to borrow from you right now, right? And so is that a maxim, a principle of volition, a rule for me to follow that is a right rule? Well, does it satisfy this formal idea of universality and necessity? So let's universalize it. Let's imagine a world in which everybody did that. If everybody, whenever it was in their self-interest, were to make a false promise about borrowing, right, we would be in a world where people wouldn't trust one another, where my utterances of requesting to borrow money would not be taken seriously, and so wouldn't result in my getting the money that I want. So the idea then of universality, however abstract and formal it is, can actually then be shown to be action guiding, because I could test my substantive rule whenever it's in my self-interest I'm going to lie, to see whether or not it satisfies the formal principle, the formal principle of universality. And so Kant then, and that's basically the argument of the first chapter of the groundwork. In the second chapter of the groundwork,
Well, I have a question on that quickly. So my first question is why is it that what we mean by morality must be necessary and universal. Because to me, what I mean by morality is whatever happens to correspond to whatever morality is in reality. So correspondence to reality, I think morality, like gravity, refers to something in reality. Whatever that is what I am referring to when I use the word morality. But it seems like Kant is more specifically referring to something necessary and universal. But I
Right.
don't get where he has the idea that that's what we mean by morality.
So, there's a lot of historical baggage that goes into why Kant presented it that way. But if I were then to say that whatever we mean by morality is what morality really is, here are some of the difficulties. First of all, that doesn't eliminate the possibility that, in fact, morality is universal and necessary. That might be
Sure.
what morality is. But let's say there are moral properties, all right? So goodness is a property that somehow attaches to a deed. Now, you're um, uh, are you familiar with the so-called queerness objections to this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, we obviously have this whole spookiness or queerness about things like that. But a related problem that I think leads to something like, that plays a role for Hume is let's say that morality is this way. Let's say that there is a mind independent, right, truth to moral claims. The problem is that how do we know it, right? So
Well,
there
why
we
does that matter? Because like the epistemic objection of how we know it, it seems to be independent of whether or not it's true. Things can be true if we don't know them. So we can just grant, for the purpose of the argument, say we don't know them, we can't know them. It doesn't make a difference. But when I use the word morality, I'm
right,
referring to whatever they are, regardless of whether or not I can know them.
right. So right, but here's part of why this matters, because morality has to do with practice, right? Morality has to do with our doings. And if I say that I am necessarily ignorant of this objective morality, that it's something that I have no real access to. There's these truths, but I have no way to get to them. Practically speaking, I still have to figure out what to do. And so, what value then does these objective moral principles have for practice if I don't have access to them? I have to come up with a morality for myself anyhow. And for Hume starts that way in setting out his moral theory. And so one way or another, the real world situation for us is we're going to have to figure out from something inside of us, something that we do have access to, how we ought to act. And the things that we have inside of us that are plausible candidates then for giving us the direction with regards to our conduct, Hume says, is either reason or feeling. And then he has his arguments as to why it can't be reason. Bad arguments, but he has his arguments. So the only thing left then is feeling. And so we have, right, sentimentalism. Right? What something means to be good basically is that I approve of it. I have a feeling of approbation towards it. And so the de facto morality for us then has to be something to which we have access.
I don't quite follow that because it seems like because the first stage of the argument is what we mean by morality is X or something along those lines. And we can mean something by it that we don't have access to. That doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, in practice, to put it into practice, we obviously need to base it off of something. That part I agree with. But there doesn't necessarily need to be a connection between our ability to base it off something and what we mean by the word. So we could mean
Right.
something that's just completely offset. We make up, we have like a lucid dream
Okay.
on
Right.
ecstasy or something, and we build it
Right.
off of that.
So let me fill in that step, right? So I think I implied it, but maybe I wasn't clear. Morality has to do with practice, right? So if we think then that morality sets the rules for what we should and shouldn't do, then I'd say I want then to adjust. I want to govern my life by those rules. And so the presumption then is that I have something cognitively that I then could use to govern my life. Now, what do I want? What do I think I need to have cognitively to govern my life? that when I talk about culture and taste, those are contingent, psychological, historical, variable, and so on. But when I want to say to people over there, if they're murdering
Oh,
somebody,
froze.
that it's still wrong, if the rules that everybody should apply. So this is, maybe let's say an implied assumption, but what's being assumed here is that what morality is, in contrast to other types of rules of culture and so on, is that they are universal. That's what I'm looking for when I think about what I want to govern my action vis-a-vis right and wrong. So you can sort of think that it's built into, this is the way I think Kant is presenting it, at least in the preface to the groundwork, that it's built into our concept of morality. And right. And so, relatedly, if there was a objective morality independent of us, then we would have this gap between the reliability of our judgment and those truths. So, to use an analogy, Kant rejects there being a transcendently real triangle, right? That mathematical objects, geometrical objects, are constructed by us as well. If there was a mind independent triangle, that when I do my geometrical judgments and I calculate things about triangles, then are my calculations right or wrong, then becomes subject to this realist norm that I don't have access to. And so I no longer could say that my mathematics have certainty to them. Now, if I think about my mathematical constructions as a priori, independent of experience, and I think about those mathematical constructions as constructions, then I could say that those constructions are constructions by virtue of a activity of the mind that's universal and necessary. The truths of mathematics are universal and necessary, but the ones that I have access to. And so I could then say that I have certainty with respect to my judgments about arithmetic and geometry. And I think that's an analogy to what Kant is thinking about with respect to morality as well. That otherwise I'm kind of lost. And actually, when in 1791, when Kant writes a paper on the problem of evil, the theodicy, and he deals with all the traditional theodicies. One of the standard theodicies is God's ways are not our ways, right? There's an ultimate moral truth that only God knows, and that's why bad things happen. We don't know it. And Kant's very curt response to that is that the cure is worse than the disease, because it then puts us in a situation of epistemic, of moral skepticism. And that moral skepticism basically makes our practical lives absurd.
Gotcha. Well, I've got a lot more questions, but we have been going for about an hour and 15 minutes, which is about our allotted time. So I really appreciate you coming on. It was great having you on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, you could just Google me, and you'll actually see a lot of newspaper op-eds. Probably, I'm a strong advocate for drug legalization and social justice reform, and lots of things that have to do with saying that there's major problems in our nation that need to be considered. So you might see some of those as well. But Google me, and you'll see some of my work listed on my department website, my academia.edu page. You can look me up there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right. You too. Thank you.